ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for attending our second virtual Freight Currents event. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marilyn Driscoll. You can call me MD. I'm the National Sales Director here at UWL, dialing in from the lovely Garden State. That's New Jersey, if you don't know. I was asked to host this event and thought to myself, well, of course, I'm Sicilian, like every Sicilian should host everything, in my opinion. But then I came to find out, very interestingly, that some of my colleagues who are on this call had bets placed against me. Being it's football season and all, I get it. But the bet was if I was going to drop some curse words on this event. So I figured if y'all going to have some fun with it, let the rest of the crowd have some fun with it. So if you want to drop on that chat, if you think MD is going to drop some curse words, go for it. Over, under, up to you. Okay? But I know who you are out there, Chris, Dylan. I heard. I caught wind. Yeah, I know you're laughing too. Anyway, so we brought together a great panel of experts this afternoon with vast knowledge, opinions, thought leadership on topics we know you want to hear about. I did want to preface, since much of what we're going to be talking about today will be driven by political or economic events, and being that it's an election year and it will be impacting trade for sure, I just want to remind everyone that any political views or stance expressed on this call are not a reflection of UWL. We value the dynamic dialogue it brings to the conversation here today, but just want to make that clear today. So with that said, I want to introduce our first panelist, John Min, Chief Economist, Managing Director of Monex, who actually joins our first event back in February. So back by popular demand, John, people liked you.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And so John's going to be talking a little bit about some U.S. economics landscapes, geopolitical conflicts, as well as the upcoming elections. Personally, I'm really interested to learn about mortgage rates and hoping that you tell me that they are dropping. I need to refinance my home, so that would be amazing. Following John, we'll hear from Peter Friedmann, the Trade and Transportation at Tipping Point National Debates, PNW Realties. He's going to share some insights on trade issues, policies. I'm eager to learn about what he has to say and on the impact of the election year as well. Lastly, certainly not least, one of my favorite humans, Martin Karczewski is going to be here, and he is the VP of Solution Engineering at UWL, and he's going to be discussing strategies for 2025 contract season, and perhaps even some of the challenges with the 2024 contract season. So with all that said, a couple of things I want to mention. My girl, Kelly Lynch, who's like my Vanna White, she's going to be in the background fielding some questions. So please use the chat, drop some questions in there. We hope to get to all of them. Thank you very much, Kelly. But if not, we will be sure to have a response to you, hopefully by the end of the week. Awesome. With that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Let me share my slides.
You got it.
Can you see them? Awesome. Just for the record, I'm a nerdy economist, so I don't cuss. And I do apologize for the first 4 slides because I'm required to present to you by our marketing department, so I'll go super fast. Monex, we've been in business for 38 years. We got 3,000 people around the world, and we do only one thing only, which is convert one currency to another currency, but at awesome exchange rate, and we deliver to 182 countries all same day, next day. We're global, we're fully licensed in all 50 states banking commission, and we have my team is based out of Washington, D.C. Now, there are 96 financial institutions that provide economic and FX forecast to Bloomberg every quarter. And I'm very proud to say since 2022, my team has been ranked in top 5 consistently, and a streak still holds even to this quarter. And so we're feeling a little bit triumphant, and I am so pleased to come back to this webinar because usually they don't invite me back if my forecast was not correct. So remember back in February, I think this was the first forecast, and this is when people were expecting U.S. economy will slip into recession, and then people were anticipating about 6 interest rate cuts by the Fed. We thought otherwise. We were contrarian back then, and we looked at 24 different macroeconomic forecasts from different banks, think tanks, universities, and the one we felt most comfortable with was one from the IMF, which their projection, which was released on first week of January. They say U.S. economy will grow roughly about 2.1%. No recession, soft landing scenario. And after 2 quarters into this calendar year, we're just bang on. It's 2.2%. Technically, it was at 2.1% as of 3 weeks ago, but these quarterly GDP numbers get revised. And the last revision, it did revise the second quarter. So combined, 2.2, no recession. We're headed for a soft landing. So we are feeling very triumphant, but there's another gentleman that feels also very triumphant. That's our Fed Chair, Powell. He spoke just 3 weeks ago at this beautiful place in Wyoming, at Jackson Hole Resort area. And this is where every August, leading central bankers, they get together and they talk about their shop, their forecasts, studies, what worked, what didn't work. And of course, Powell was under pressure for a long time because back in 2021, as you recall, inflation that was always below 2% for many years suddenly rose. It went up to about 4.5%. Initially, Chairman Powell dismissed it by using his famous word, it's transitory. Don't worry about it. It will go away if the supply chain normalizes. Then, of course, at the middle of 2022, he said, oops, we were wrong because inflation rate reached 8%. And this is core inflation rate, which means even if you exclude very volatile categories of gas and food, inflation was well above 5%. So in a panic mode, the Federal Reserve jacked up the interest rate from 0% to 5.2%, and they crossed their fingers that this should work. And sure enough, as of last reading, it took about 16 months for the inflation rate to come down from about 8% to a little bit below 3% as of last month. And of course, the more preferred measure of inflation is called personal consumption expenditure. This is a little nerdy thing. We don't like CPI. That's what you guys read about it on the newspapers and websites. CPI, 42% of the CPI is made up of rental cost. Problem with the rental cost is it lags the economy by 12 months because rental prices doesn't change that often. So it kind of distorts the inflation picture. PCE, the rental component is only 22%. It's more realistic, it's more timely. Based on that reading, we're headed to the Fed's explicit target of 2%. We're about 2.4% as of last month. And if the current trend continues, it's going to be a nice disinflation down to 2%. So well done, Mr. Fed Chair Powell. But of course, those nerdy economists out there, we know there's famous trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Technically, it's known as Phillips curve. An idea is that if you bring down inflation from 8-9% down to 3%, there's no free lunch in economics. You have to give up something. What's the trade-off? Structurally within the economy, we would see a rise of unemployment. And that's exactly what we saw. Our unemployment rate was 3.4% about 15 months ago, which was at the lowest level we've seen in 55 years. And now it's at 4.3% as of July's data. So that's a big significant improvement. But I was really puzzled by this. Unemployment rate increased from 3.4 to 4.3%, yet people filing for the unemployment insurance for the first time, these are people getting laid off, that number stayed very low. So unemployment rate went up without the layoff. So that's the mystery. So hold on to that. Of course, for this wonky economists out there, there's another rule we always talk about, which is Psalms rule. And Psalms rule says if the 3-month moving average of unemployment rate increases by 0.5%, we're already in recession. And that was the case last 8 recessions. Those shaded bars are the recessionary time. It usually comes every 7 to 8 years in the US economy. Last 8 times, when unemployment rate rose significantly, that's a sure sign of inflation. But at Monex, we don't think that's the case this time. In other words, this is famous quote, this time is different. And I think it is different. And here's the reason why. We had a huge surge of immigration in 2023. 2.5 million net gain in immigrants coming into the United States, which means huge pool of labor force coming in. And this year we're averaging about, I think we're going to average about 2 million, which is again, massive surge. So you got all these folks coming into the United States, and obviously what's the first thing they're going to do? Look for a job. So that's the technical definition of unemployment. At the same time, the last surge in unemployment we've seen in the last 2 months is due to two unique components, elements of the folks. One is new entrants, that's the brownish bar. That's the new immigrants coming in and they raise their unemployment rate because they're looking for a job. The next one is new entrants. Now this is interesting. These are more than likely folks who retired early during the COVID shutdown period, but then they experienced higher prices and their retirement was not able to sustain whatever their lifestyle they want, and they're coming back into the labors. We have seen a huge surge of people coming back into the labor force after retirement. So when you combine these two, that explains most of the unemployment rate gain in month of June and July. And I didn't add the August data because it just came out last week. This was after I prepared this slide. In August, unemployment rate went down to 4.2%. So I think our narrative is pretty viable at this point. So what does it mean for the rest of the year, for next 6 months even? We are anticipating a soft landing for the US economy. And if you ever want to know what's happening to the US economy, just go to Google, type in Atlanta Fed GDP now. What Atlanta Fed does on their website is they share with you real time what their model is reading, where the US economy is going based on latest economic indicator. And as of this morning, it picked up based on some favorable economic indicators we've seen in the last couple of days. US economy is growing at about 2.5%. That's a beautiful soft landing scenario. Now, that being the case, my wife always says economists are dismal. We're always pessimistic. So we do have to worry about things. One thing a lot of people are worrying about is US consumers, and that's why you've been hearing some recessionary words recently. And main reason is because we had a $2.1 trillion worth of COVID savings. That's all those stimulus checks that we all received. And as of my analysis, we used up all of that excess COVID savings fund as of May of this year. So we spent all that COVID stimulus money. And that it may explain why we are now seeing record low household savings rate. It's only at 4%. We usually were at 8%. So we used up all the COVID savings. We're saving less, and at the same time, we're jacking up our household debts. Now, three areas that we saw a huge increase in recently is the mortgage debt, auto loan debt, credit card debt. Now I can explain the first two. Mortgage debt rate the debt amount going up it makes sense because housing prices are at record levels. So you have to borrow more. Auto loans, they also make sense because I don't know whether you checked the price of new car lately. Average price of new car in the United States is $45,000. Obviously you have to take on a bigger loan. The area we're really concerned about is credit card. American households has about $1.7 trillion worth of net credit card debt at the average finance cost of 22% per month, so annualized. So that's a big concern. That being the case, at Monex, we're very optimistic. We will land this thing nicely. It will be a soft landing as long as we grow the job each month. And based on our calculation, we need to generate about 110,000 jobs per month going forward to keep this narrative going. And last month, we just got the report last week again on so this is September to August data, we generated 142,000 jobs. So we're well above 110,000. What that means is that people who are working in the United States, we're hitting record numbers, and they're all collecting paychecks. And what's really nice about these paychecks is we have real gains. After all, we do live in a real economy, so we need to get real gains on our paycheck. So what does it mean? In the United States right now, hourly earnings are growing. The wages are growing at about 4%, but now inflation is 3%. So we have a net real gain of 1%. So all these million Americans who are working every single day, They are living by paycheck to paycheck. I do admit that, but those paychecks have real gains built into it. As a result, American consumers are feeling confident again. I was really worried 6 months ago. The consumer confidence index, when it drops to 80 level, that's a sure sign of inflation. And I thought maybe we would collapse down to 80. Instead, it's stabilized, and now we're beginning to see a pickup. So consumers are feeling confident, and of course, consumers make up 70% of the US GDP in terms of spending. And guess what? Every single month, we're seeing record level of retail sales. So that posed really well for US economy growing at about 2.5% for next 6 months. At the same time, something is happening which I cannot explain, but it's a good thing, which is that the US productivity level is increasing at 2.5%, which is almost double what we have experienced in the last 15 years, which is 1.5. I don't think it's AI thing, it's too early for that, but we don't know why, but productivity has really increased in the last 3 to 4 years, which is a good sign, because then businesses are operating their unit at a lower labor cost, so they're being more efficient. That may explain why we had second quarter earnings that I've been listening to by the public companies. They're averaging earnings growth of 12%. That also explains why we're seeing record stock index prices at the levels, because the US companies are very profitable. And other than the good news is that if companies are more productive, they can pay higher wages without raising inflation, which all spells Goldilocks. It's a beautiful arrangement, and based on everything we see, we do expect US economy to grow at 2%, slightly higher going forward, no recession, mostly driven by gain in labor productivity, not necessarily number of hours worked, but it's a nice Goldilocks scenario that we're forecasting. Of course, I know some people want to refinance their mortgage. I have a good news for you. There might be a tailwind first quarter, second quarter of next year, because if you look at the bond trading and you go to Chicago Mercantile Exchange, you look at those interest rate swaps. Right now, the bond trader is expecting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 interest rate cuts in next 5 successive Fed meetings. Starting next week, by the way, September 18th, we expect first rate cut of 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. Collectively, I think it's going to be about 1.5% in the next 6 months. You know what that means? If you have a mortgage of $400,000, that's extra savings of $400 a month for you to spend with the lower. And there might be a chance that this could provide tailwind for consumer spending beginning of the next year. So maybe a 2.5% growth is achievable. Of course, being an economist, I can't forget about the black swan effect. These are the things we cannot forecast. And of course, area I'm really concerned about is geopolitical issues, especially what's happening around Suez Canal. That corridor is responsible for about 20% of global shipping. And right now with Houthi attacks, all the shipment is getting rerouted through the Cape of Good Hope. And of course, that's adding extra 10 days for shipment from Asia to Europe. And of course, delay in shipments, extra 10 days can compound. As a result, we're not surprised to see the cost of containers being shipped globally has almost tripled in the last 2-3 months. And we do know from the COVID shutdown period, there's a direct transmission between higher shipping costs and inflation. If the situation in the Middle East gets worse, and even Ukraine, then we may see another acceleration of inflation due to supply side of the issue, not the demand side. So that's something we're really worried about. Of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the election that's coming up. We have a big debate tonight. I think I'm very excited about it. Either way, we were in the foreign exchange business, so we've been advising our clients for the past 2 months, be careful with these two currencies, Mexican peso and Chinese yuan. Last time Trump won the election back in 2016, these currencies just collapsed. And we expect the same type of volatility if the Trump regains the administration this time. And of course, this time, I think the euro is also at risk. There's a fundamental difference in policies between Trump and Harris. As a result, we may see some volatility in euro currency in the market as well. But of course, one thing I am concerned about as a macroeconomist is the effect of tariff on the US economy and our forecast. Both parties, it doesn't matter who wins the administration. I think they're going to raise tariffs in the United States, not as extreme as I think the last proposal for the Trump campaign is any imports coming into the United States would be a 10% tariff. Anything coming from China would be 60%. If I put those numbers into my model, we're looking at a drag of about 1.4% growth of US economy. So at the end of the day, I don't know the exact measures, but tariffs could drag the US economic growth. So we may go below 2% if we're too aggressive on tariff as well. Of course, something that no one is talking about, and I don't think this is going to become an issue until second half next year. So, but be watch out for the rising US public debt. As of last week, the total US public debt was $34 trillion. US economy is $28 trillion in GDP. That means if you do the simple math, the debt to GDP ratio is 120%. And that's a magical number, and I'll explain why that's the case. Meanwhile, the number I've been really looking at is the number that's circled. That's the interest payment on the debt just to keep this thing going. And at the end of this calendar year, I am projecting that number is going to be greater than entire budgeted funds for the defense for this year. And then in 3 years, unless we do something about it, it will be greater than all the money we spend on Medicaid and Medicare. So this is something that we should really worry about. And of course, that 120% GDP to 100% debt to GDP ratio. Reason it's so special in macroeconomics world is that empirically, when economies get to that level of debt, we see a significant slowdown in the growth. So I am not as optimistic about U.S. growth rate second half of next year versus first half of next year. Now, that being the case, this could be the shock that I was talking about. If Trump follows up on all his campaign promises, it's going to add another $5.8 trillion to our public debt. If the Harris campaign follows through on all the promises, it will be an additional $1.2 trillion debt. This could be a shock in the credit market. And then, of course, I suspect next year, then we may lose our AAA credit rating from the last credit agency. There are 3 major ones globally. We have been downgraded by 2 out of 3. I think there's a chance if our debt just accelerates after the election, there's a chance we're going to be downgraded. And of course, that would have an adverse effect on stocks in the United States. That's what we have seen last 3 times. Whenever there were downgrades, there's immediate effect on the US stock market. Now that becomes really important from our perspective at Monex because this, I don't want to say it's a dirty secret, it's not anything dirty about it, but it's a sad secret, which is that because of income inequality in the United States, top 20% of American household is responsible for 40% of consumer spending. And the bottom 40% is responsible for 20% of consumer spending. So based on our model, we will not fall into a recession, a significant downturn, unless the top 20% of the household cuts down their spending. And that's exactly the case last 2 recessions we had in the US. Right now, top 20% of the US household are feeling fine because most of them have locked in a mortgage rate at below 3%, near 3%, and they're enjoying record stock high prices and home prices. And they're continue to spend, and that's 40% of spending. That may be the reason why we're avoiding recession, despite the fact that most Americans feeling miserable with the debt and everything else. But if there's a negative wealth effect, such as significant downturn in stock market, I don't think there will be a significant downturn in the housing market because of the housing shortage. If that happens, then we may definitely see a recession. But more than likely, any story like that may not unfold till the second half of next year. So the bottom line is you can't control the weather, but prepare for it. Right now, we're anticipating a soft landing, but no guarantees. It takes any one of these shocks to tip us over into recession second half of next year. And if I am invited back on the next webinar, that means my forecast was correct. If you don't see me, that we had the wrong narrative. And I can't stop the sharing, so I need help.
I'm sure you'll be back, John.
I hope so too.
Hey, John, we have a question for you, if you don't mind answering. Do the job numbers include government jobs?
Yes, in fact, that's a great question. 1 out of 6 jobs we've been creating so far this year have been government jobs. So if you take that out, the private sector jobs, when you just count for that, we are below 110,000. We're about 96,000 a month. So in many respects, we are creating jobs, and we're tipping over the 110 threshold with the government jobs. Yes.
Okay, great. Any other questions? We have another minute before we turn it over to Peter. Feel free to drop it in the chat. Going once. Okay, well, if you do, drop them in and we can get you a response later on today or by the end of the week for sure.
Hey, MD, there is one more question. I just flipped it onto the note.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, okay, here we go. Any insight on the rumor that Harris admin might tax unrealized capital gains?
Personally, I hope not. I'm one of those 20% who have really benefited from rising asset prices, so they kind of mitigated the effect of inflation. I just don't know how you can calculate, and I also taught finance at graduate schools. I just don't know how they're going to calculate the tax amount doing the mark to market, because stock prices, they're very volatile. You may have gains this quarter, you may have losses next quarter. I think it's impossible test. So if you ask me point blank, is she going to be able to do it? I say no.
Okay. Thank you for that. And there's a few questions coming in wanting to know if we're going to be sharing this deck out. So the answer is yes, we'll be sharing this out with everyone at the end of the call.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate your time and information today. Super insightful. Amazing. All right. Martin, I think I'm going to Peter first. Although, Peter, I don't see your face, and I just want to let you know that. There we go. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you? How's everybody?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good, good.
Well, fantastic. I'm going to turn it right over to you then.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. And John, that was very, very helpful, very useful. I'm a Monex customer, actually. So I have high hopes for gold sometimes, but that generally reflects less high hopes for the stock market. So mixed feeling. Anyway, thank you very much for hosting this. I'm delighted to join you all. UWL has been an ally and a friend of both the Pacific Coast Council of Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders and the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. Just as introduction, so all know, the customs brokers and freight forwarders are the ones that facilitate all international trade. There is virtually nothing that comes into this country or leaves this country that an independent licensed customs broker hasn't had some role in, or a freight forwarder. Customs brokers are regulated and licensed and administered by the Department of Homeland Security and the Customs and Border Protection underneath. They are absolutely in the midst of all these issues that we've been talking about today, that John's been talking about, international trade. If it comes from China or leaves to China, a freight forwarder or customs broker has something to do with it, or any other country, including Mexico, including Canada. At the same time, the Agriculture Transportation Coalition is comprised of virtually all exporters of all agriculture products from the United States, and many imports. At least all commodities, all states, all regions are represented by some. The Journal of Commerce has deemed it the voice of agriculture in U.S. transportation policy. So let me talk a little bit about some of these transportation and trade issues. I spent 6 years on Capitol Hill in the Senate, working for the Senate Finance Committee and the Commerce Committee, and wrote a number of pieces of legislation, the Ocean Shipping Act, as well as some of the trade legislation. So it's certainly fun, if you will, to be anticipating an election debate tonight, and an election where these issues of trade and transportation, international trade and tax, are going to be central to the debate, and they're central to this election. And first, I'm going to talk about transportation first, and then trade, and a little bit on tax. But I just did a little blurb for a national publication, and I gave it what I thought was a little tongue-in-cheek heading, figuring they were going to take that off and not make it the title. But my title is, "Which Candidate is Worse When It Comes to Trade?" Trick question. It's a trick question. Which candidate is worse? Now, we'll address that now. Which candidate is going to be worse when it comes to international trade? And I'll say it again, it's a trick question. But before we get that, we've got another issue that's right front and center for our economy, and that is the threat of a strike by the labor union that controls all cargo entering or leaving the U.S. by ocean seaport on the East Coast, on the Gulf Coast, in the Great Lakes, and possibly impacting other coasts, West Coast and the Canadian East Coast. That's well over 50% of everything coming in and out of the country. So if everybody's talking about, oh, we're concerned about all that's coming in from China, all the manufacturing, all electronic vehicles, all the clothing, footwear, and apparel coming from China, how does it get here? It gets here on ship, and it's coming through the seaports, and over half go through the ports that are possibly going to be the victim of a labor strike, a threatened strike, very clearly threatened, where the president of that union has said, "I'll cripple you," frightening words from an individual who has real control over the labor that serves East Coast, Gulf Coast, Great Lakes. And so we got to pay attention to that. Where that is right now is that they're negotiating. That union wants an 80% pay raise over 6 years, $5 an hour each year for 6 years. They want an absolute ban on automation. And even while all the rest of industry and commerce and our lives are being automated because of efficiency, faster, and so forth, they are absolutely opposed to automation at the terminal. So we will fall further behind the rest of the world in the efficiency of our international trade, where containers move up and down cranes in China or in Europe, and so about 50, 60 containers an hour. We're about 27, 28, 29, and stuck there for the last 30 years. We haven't improved it. We don't want automation if we're going to keep our ports operating, because labor has said on the East Coast and West Coast, they're opposed to automation. And we see that in every port in the United States and Canada as well. So, and I don't see, frankly, and nobody does, an opportunity to improve that. Now, some of the demands, in addition to the anti-automation, in addition to the wages and benefits, are seen as rather overwhelming and overreaching. However, let's face reality. We've had quite a few unions over the course of the last 4 years, 3 years, imposing demands, seeking renegotiation of the contracts, seeking pretty dramatic increases in wages and so forth. And why is that? Why in the last 3 years? the President of the United States has given us the reason. He has said that he is the best friend organized labor has had in the White House forever. And he's honest, he's right, he's accurate. Sometimes you have administrations that are more favorable to employers, management, and other times to unions. And right now we have to unions. So you recall over the last 3 years with the UPS almost struck. In fact, briefly it did for a day. We have the railroads almost because there were negotiations. We had the West Coast Longshore Union spent a year negotiating, even without after a contract expired, and a lot of uncertainty as to whether they would get a contract without actually shutting down the ports. Fortunately, the ports were not shut down. So we have uncertainty when it comes to rail, not just rail, truck and other transportation unions, and now ocean. And generally they have been resolved, this uncertainty, when the White House and the Department of Labor gets involved. And generally what has happened is that the management gives the union what it asked for, what it is demanding. And we think quite clearly the White House has had a role in making sure that happens. The White House does not want disruption. Now, speaking of disruption, can you imagine the disruption? Over half the seaports in the United States stop functioning. Here we are 2 months before the November presidential elections. If all our seaports stop functioning, our economy spirals down. We do not want it. None of us in this industry want it. But certainly, if you're a candidate for president and you're the incumbent, you don't want it. So there's going to be a lot of intervention from the White House to prevent that from spiraling into a long-term disruption of imports. But it's going to happen, and it's going to have an impact. And what will happen is transportation is going to be more expensive, importing and exporting more expensive. And when exporting becomes more expensive, since there's nothing we produce in agriculture or transportation here in the US that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world, if we can't export, if we can't deliver it affordably, dependably to our foreign customers, those foreign customers will find someplace else. Fresh fruit and vegetables, you can get it from Chile and Peru, lumber and wood products from Scandinavia and Russia, beef and other protein, chicken and so forth from Europe, from Argentina, from Brazil, soybeans, also Brazil and other places. So you can get the same product that we're exporting from other places, and if it gets expensive or disruptive, our customers in India and in the Middle East and in China and Korea, they'll go right to someplace else, and it's hard to get that business back. That is something that's not widely discussed right now, but that will be the result if there's, in fact, a strike at the end of September, which is being threatened now by the president of the International Longshore Association. That's the East and Gulf Coast Union. Now, here's something else. And we get back to my question, which candidate for president is worse when it comes for international trade? Which is worse? Well, step back. Right now, protectionism is very popular in policy circles. We've always talked about how we want Republicans and Democrats to work together. We claim to like bipartisanship. Well, careful what you ask for, you might get it, and we've got it now. For all of us here who care about international trade and international commerce, we've got bipartisanship, and that bipartisanship is around protectionism. Republicans and Democrats are both protectionist. They are both seeking to reduce imports from China and other places. They are both supporting sanctions that restrict and reduce trade. And we have a little bit of history, and this isn't politics, this is just history. 6 years ago, President Trump imposed rather draconian tariffs, unprecedented, on a broad variety of products coming from China, the Trump tariffs. So those were there for 2 years before he lost his reelection bid and Joe Biden came in. Joe Biden could have, at that time, said, I'm going to revoke them, just like Trump imposed them, I'll revoke them. He did not. In fact, he did not, but not one Republican, not one Democrat among the 435 in the House of Representatives, members of Congress, Congresspeople, and 100 senators in the Senate, you would have thought one of them would have proposed to rescind those Trump, now Biden, tariffs. No one did. No one even went to the floor of the Congress, and we are there a lot, watch it a lot. Not one did go down there and even say they're a bad idea, because they all want to get reelected and they all know protectionism and beating up on China is very popular. So the new, when Trump came in, the Republicans also had a majority in the House, and they set up a committee, the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. Select Committee on China CCP. Sounds pretty aggressive, right, against China? Well, again, we would have thought in years past one party would have been opposed or not. No, that is the one committee of Congress, and this does not get any press. That's the one committee of Congress where both Republicans and Democrats are working together. They pass many pieces of bills out. They put a lot of resolutions out and nary a dispute internally. It's half Republican, half Democrat, like other committees on Congress, but unlike the other committees, they are agreeing to be putting out a series of bills, 31 proposed bills that are going to be considered next week in the House of Representatives in what's called China Week. Some are minor, some are major. Some would create very substantial changes in our policy for imports from China that is done by express couriers, what Amazon and others depend upon. They are exempting products under certain circumstances, which are easily met, the circumstances, from import duties, and even from the strict scrutiny that other imports are typically imposed upon. So without this de minimis, and it's called de minimis treatment, we wouldn't have these overnight deliveries. And I don't know about you, but we get a lot of stuff ordered by somebody in our house, delivered constantly at our doorstep, things that I don't think we need, but we buy because they're cheap. They come overnight. We love them. America loves that. It's made possible by de minimis. We don't know what's coming in through de minimis. Is it drugs? Is it ammunition? Is it counterfeit medicines? We don't know, but it's pouring in. That's coming into our country. And there are proposals in both the Senate and the House by Republicans and Democrats to significantly restrict those, restrain those. However, they're not moving forward through Congress yet. Again, people like the trade and all that. And while we say we're protectionist, we want to bring manufacturing home, do we really? And do we want to bash China? Yes. We're not allowing their electric vehicles to come into the United States, even though they're less expensive and very good quality. But we are talking on Capitol Hill about bringing manufacturing home. Many members of Congress, when they say, I want to bring manufacturing home, back from China, back from Korea, back from Vietnam and India and so forth, they're thinking home. Where's home? Is home Yakima, Washington? Is home Stockton, California? Is home Junction City, Kansas? That's what they're thinking. They're thinking, bring it home to where they live, where they represent. You know what home is turned out to be under our various laws? Home is Mexico. The manufacturing comes with the Chinese companies, other companies sending parts, huge volumes of parts to China, to Mexico, to a factory that is built by and owned by the Chinese manufacturer that was manufacturing them previously in China, assembled there, and then coming into the United States across the border. And then it comes here duty free. But that's manufacturing coming home. We are completely confused in our trade policies, and people are going to address it. Now, what happened last time with the the Trump tariffs? Well, the Trump tariffs, I started after 2 years of Trump tariffs that became the Biden tariffs, when he had 4 years, Biden-Harris, 4 years to rescind them. And then after approximately 2 years of that, they were slated to expire. He extended them, he renewed them. So they're the Trump-Biden tariffs. And, you know, each side can point to that, oh, you're more protectionist than I am. No, they're both protectionist. They were the Trump-Biden tariffs. So what we have now are two candidates who are saying you're worse than I'm better, but they're both the same. And we're here seeing the same thing with Harris. So now both of these candidates, I'm looking forward to seeing how they squirm out of this. Which candidate's worse when it comes to international trade? They're both worse. They're both worse. So that's what we got to see. Now, what's the other thing that they're both looking for now? They're both looking for the union vote. That's very clear. You'll hear it tonight. They're both, that was a key to why Trump changed the dynamic and won before. And Kamala Harris is a big supporter of unions as well. They're both union supporters. The unions want restricted imports, want protectionism. So they're working together. They will never admit it. They're advocating the same thing when it comes to trade. And this select committee and the China Week is going to throw a lot of things out there for politicians in this election year. And don't forget, all the Congress people, 435, are running for election. They're going to be pounding the table too against not allowing China to intrude on our society and our economy as they have. So those are the concerns ahead. And finally, let me get back to transportation for a moment, because it's all interconnected with our economy. The Panama Canal is opening up again. Deeper draft, ships can go through, ships can come around. That's helpful. That reduces the cost. What's not changing is the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. That is going to remain the way it is. And think about this. This is the first time really in human history where a major trade route has been closed off, and the world's great powers have allowed it to be that way. The United States, Thomas Jefferson, the Barbary Coast pirates, closed off the through into the passage by the Rock of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Ocean, which is a major trade route at the time. The Barbary Coast pirates closed down. We had a tiny nascent navy then, but we sent it and we blew them out of the water. And now there was no press watching how many people died with that, who knows, but they opened it up. And that has happened elsewhere too. China, other places, they opened up a trade route. Nobody's opening up this major trade route through the Suez and the Mediterranean, which is causing cargo that would come from India and Vietnam, even China, but all the way around, down around South America and into the East Coast. So what we have is most of the ports, over 50% of the ports in this country, and over 50% of the cargo entering this country cannot come efficiently through its routes that it usually does, which is the East and Gulf Coast. What's going to happen? The cargo has to go all the way around across the Pacific. The ships have to go much further. We don't know what's going to happen longer term, but in the foreseeable future, this is causing a movement of cargo from traditional trade routes to new trade routes, which add cost. It's a massive inflationary pressure. Also inflationary pressure is the higher wages that are being paid to unions who are successful in their bids. I'm not saying the higher wages aren't deserved. I'm just saying that's a result. So, you know, people are saying, oh, the inflation's over, everybody can be happy. We've got some underlying pressures that need to be addressed, at least. So which candidate is worst? When it comes to international trade, you can make your own judgments on everything else, but when it comes, they're both worst. I would be happy for international trade and everybody who depends on international trade if we get a third candidate in there, because both of these are really bad, and we're going to have one of them. Maybe tonight will let us know which one we're going to have. So with that happy news and anticipation for tonight, I thank you very much for the opportunity to join you.
Peter, thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind answering them quickly. So several people want to know if the West Coast, or if your opinion, if the West Coast will be joining the strike.
Bottom line, probably not. And here's the difference. The answer is normally no. The answer would be no. Now, there's two things. One is when the unions say we're in solidarity, and we've had this when the West Coast, U.S. West Coast goes out, or has a work stoppage, the Canadian West Coast, even though it's part of the same union, they say we're in solidarity, but they continue working. But if the ship is coming into Seattle or LA and Long Beach, and because there's a work disruption in those places, it diverts up to Vancouver, Canada, the union up there won't work it. That's the solidarity. It's happening on the East Coast now. If a ship is coming into an East Coast port, coming across the Atlantic, and they go through the Panama Canal to a West Coast port, the ILWU, the West Coast Union, is not going to work it. They're going to show solidarity that way. But that's a short-term deal, because if you know that's going to happen, you won't send your ship to the East Coast port, and that's already happening. So they'll send a ship to the West Coast and they'll work it. What's unusual right now, and we just heard from a little private conversation with a representative of all the marine terminals on the West Coast and the ports, with some input from steamship lines that I've had over the last week. The ILA, the East Coast Union, and the president, Mr. Daggett, the one who said, "I'll cripple you," has said that he wants to send pickets from the East Coast. This hasn't happened before, to the West Coast, and picket. And then the union guys on the West Coast Union, it's a completely different union, wouldn't cross it, because they just don't cross other labor picket lines. That will take us into court cases, litigation, arbitration, and so forth. And that would be a massive disruption. Yes, maybe it'll be declared illegal, but so what if the union isn't crossing it and isn't working it on the West Coast? So that would be a sporadic determinations by individual longshoremen on the West Coast. Wouldn't be that the West Coast Union is joining the East Coast Union, but the impact would be the same. We're keeping our fingers crossed right now, but there's a general sense out there among those that are on the negotiating committees, none of whom have spoken on the record, and will deny it if you count them, there's a sense that the ILA wants to have a strike. Even if they were to get all that they're asking, that they want to have a strike. Whether that's true or not is obviously something we would have to see. But, you know, if you want to have a victory, you got to beat somebody. It's not that, it doesn't feel like a real victory if you ask for it and you get it. So that's what we're dealing with here. There's a lot of ego involved here. There's a lot of chest pounding here. It is not strictly a business negotiation. So maybe you should ask a psychiatrist some of these questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Peter, for the insight. Absolutely amazing. Thank you for your time today as well. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Of course. Martin, I'm going to turn it over to you with the 4 minutes we have left.
Sure. So appreciate that. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, John. Great content. And both of these guys are available on various social media channels. So be sure to connect. Yeah, I'm going to bookend today and not go through these slides, excuse me, because a lot of what's here has already been talked about. But I think as it relates to the ILA and the movement of goods via the Cape and also the Panama Canal, right, it has improved, but likely we'll be back here again 12 months from now because historically that's been the case. There is a project that's on deck right now to talk about a huge mining program that would essentially draw water from a reservoir to help the canal, but that's 5 years away and a couple of $1 billion. I think that for me, from a shipping perspective, what we've seen over the last few years, COVID and beyond, is that steamship lines have done two things. Number one, they've largely insulated themselves from the costs that are associated to the dislocation of their services as they navigate these challenges. But more importantly, they profit from those scenarios. So ocean freight rates went to $8, $10, $12, $15,000 during COVID. We saw some pretty expensive ocean freight rates over the last 6-8 months. So likely, whatever it is that happens as a relationship to the ILA, you're going to see ocean freight rates potentially increase again. I think the other thing that we're starting to see is carriers kind of jockey for position as the 2M is dissolved and the Gemini cooperation is introduced. We're starting to see partnerships that are not inside of traditional alliances, and that's something that we continue to pay attention to. That's kind of where we are. I think looking forward, a lot of what Peter and John talked about this morning is just generally supply chains are very fragile, and you can build as resilient of a supply chain as you can, but something happens somewhere else in the world and it negatively impacts you, and your ability to predict that is almost impossible. So incorporating supply chain partners that have proven or can prove that there are safety nets or measures that they can introduce and implement as you're picking your providers for 25 and beyond is really important. I think this year was probably the most egregious example of this, but as you go into thinking about contracts for 2025 and 2026, don't wait. Know what your number is, have a real good pulse on what you can afford to spend on what trade route for what commodity, and get your deal done early. I think there were a lot of shippers that waited into late April and even into May to try and eke out a few dollars on the actual ocean freight expense side, and largely got left out in the cold when it came to contracting. So start planning early, really understand what it is that you're looking to achieve from a numbers perspective, have that number in mind as you enter your negotiation, and try and get your deal done as early as you possibly can. The other piece to that, as far as know your number, I think we've all seen and we're experiencing right now that the ability for a carrier to manipulate a particular situation by way of surcharges is something that they've done forever. They did it very, very successfully during COVID. They've done it very successfully this year. Unlikely that will continue. So any contract that you're negotiating that is no peak season and no Panama Canal and no GRI and no this, no that is just sort of futile at this point. So assume that those surcharges are going to continue to be in play and incorporate them accordingly. I think the other piece for me, and this is somewhat self-serving, I understand that, but trying to pit your NVO against your carrier when you look to do an RFQ heading into 25, it just is becoming, from my perspective or from our perspective, a bit of a mistake, right? We are not the same. We behave differently. Our value proposition is different from one another. And so have one RFQ that has got 6 ocean carriers and 5 MVOs just inherently doesn't work. So consider separating those RFQs. I realize that from an administration perspective, it's a little bit more work, but if you can spend the time up front and really get to a place where you're comparing apples to apples, I think you're going to end up with a better net result. And then lastly for me, and then MD closes out, I think we're all seeing that your ability to forecast honestly, accurately, and often is winning the day right now, being able to sit down with either your MVO or your carrier partner, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and rather than taking your annual container count and dividing it by 52 and thinking that you're going to be in good shape, largely doesn't work these days. So build a system that enables you to forecast honestly, accurately, and much more frequently, and I think you'll end up in a better spot. There you go. 6 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm 1 minute over.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Martin. As I know we're over time, I want to thank everyone for joining today, your participation, your attendance. Final ask, please, please, please take 1 minute. It'll take actually less than 1 minute to fill out the survey that's coming your way. Let us know what your feedback was on today's event, what you want to hear in the future. More importantly, if you want me to be your host again, because I think I should. Have a great afternoon, everyone.